Hello and welcome to BigID's University Education. Today we're going to talk about data lifecycle management. We're going to talk about what data lifecycle management is, why enterprise companies need to have data lifecycle management, so the challenges they face, and how BigID can help. With that, let's get started. First of all, why do enterprise companies need a data lifecycle management solution? Well, companies need to think about their data lifecycle plans because different data has different expiration, and you don't want to have extra data that you don't need. You also want to make sure that you are complying with regulatory requirements to delete or retain data. What that means is there's different rules, different laws that say what type of data needs to be retained or deleted under certain timeframes. So, for example, you might have an employee data that needs to be retained for, say, 2 years or 5 years or 7 years. You might have healthcare data that needs to be retained for, say, 5 years or until a minor becomes an adult. Or if you have an adult, you might need to retain records for, for 10 years or sometimes even for life, depending on where you're located, because different geographies have different rules about what types of data need to be retained for what type of periods. So it's also about what type of data needs to be retained and then when it must be deleted. So you might have rules that say that data needs to be retained for a certain amount of time, say 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, or even shorter durations, and then it must be deleted after, say, 7 years or 5 years, and that's for privacy rules. So in order to be compliant with all of these different regulatory requirements, it's important to know what type of data you have and then be able to make sure that you are saving or deleting data as appropriate. We want to make sure that we are applying consistent retention policies across all of our data sources. So what that means is you don't want to address only one data source. You want to make sure that you have the same retention policies across all your data sources to make sure that you are complete. Also, if someone says, please delete my data, or you need to retain data until it must be deleted, make sure that all that data, all related data, is deleted appropriately, that you don't have extra sensitive data available that that is not relevant anymore. Also, we want to reduce risk and the cost. So you want to eliminate expired data because you have extra data that is sensitive personal data that is available when it should not be. You're just increasing your risk, and that's not necessary for, it's just extra risk that you don't need to be taking on. It's also an additional cost. There's a cost to storing data that you don't need, both in the actual cost of storing the data with, whatever data storage that you have, but also there's a cost of having all of your data workers having this extra data and just noise in your environment, because they're going to have to sort through and just basically dig past that data to get to what they actually need. So there's this cost of time and efficiency as well. We want to make sure also that we're saving information for legal holds. Here it gets extra complicated because it's not like you just have a rule. If you could just have a rule that says, just delete all my data after 7 years, that might be an easier way to do it. But the reality is that sometimes, even though data should be expired after a certain time, some data you need to save because, let's say you are having legal conversations, that data needs to be retained, even though it might be under some other retention policy rule. So making sure that you know what the priority is, what needs to be retained, what needs to be deleted, what needs to be saved, and then how to do that across all of your data sources. That gets pretty complex. And enterprise companies need to be aware of this because they need to make sure they are handling data responsibly. Just as a visual, let's imagine that your data, that all these stars represent your data. They are vast, they are kind of out of reach, and they are just kind of everywhere up in the sky. So if we think about all these different stars as little data points, you could say maybe perhaps this piece of data needs to be saved for 7 years and then deleted. And this other data needs to be saved for 10 years and deleted. This other data needs to be deleted after 5 years. Or data must be saved for 5 years past some specific event. Or there's some obscure piece of data that would be ready to delete, but this time I need to save it for a legal hold. Or just data must be retained for a minimum of 2 years. So all these different rules are coming into play across all your different data points. And if you're trying to manage this all manually, you can imagine it would get very, very complex. And so how do you apply all these different rules to all these different data types, and even just knowing what kind of data it is? So if it's employee data, it might need to be having different rules than, say, customer data, or purchase data. It might be different than other employee data or other customer data. So making sure you know what data you have, what are the applicable rules, and then how to apply those rules to that data to make sure that you are being compliant. These are the enterprise challenges in data lifecycle management. So the problems that we've talked about are that regulations vary by type of information. So as we discussed, you might have healthcare information that is different than having employee information. So if you are running a sort of medical facility, you have different types of patient information, employee information, all kinds of different insurance information. That information is going to change depending on the type of it is. Is it an address? Is it a customer ID? Whatever that type of information is, might determine what it needs to be saved or deleted. Also, regulations vary by the subject and owner of the information. So if we talk about a minor in healthcare, there are rules, some places that say that you need to save information for a minor up until they turn 18 or 21, and then it needs to be deleted maybe some number of years after. Or for an adult, it needs to be deleted after some number of years. But if you're in a different state or a different country, the rules may be different because regulations vary by geography. So there are rules, privacy regulations that say you need to retain data for a certain amount of time, and then it must be deleted. And that period of retaining and deleting data could vary depending on where you are. Also, different states, different countries have different rules that might protect their people differently. And so those citizens might have different restrictions on having their data saved or deleted. So people need to know, especially if you're running maybe a multinational company or you're operating in different countries or having different customers, need to know what regulations apply to your population so that you can apply the appropriate regulations. Also, data environments are complex. So making sure that you are managing data not just in one environment, but across all of your data sources, it can get very complex. And making sure that you are compliant and complete is important. So if you have a data lifecycle, a data retention policy, or a data regulation, you need to make sure that applies to all of your data in all of your data environments. Also, it's possible that stakeholders within your own organization may have conflicting priorities. For example, you might have a team of data scientists who says they would really like to have as much data as possible because they want to do modeling, and having more data over many, many years will help build models. However, you might have, and then on the same company, you could have your security and privacy team saying you want to delete all data because you don't want to have extra security exposure and extra security risk. So same organization, two different stakeholders with just conflicting priorities, much better to have a data lifecycle rule that just says, this is the business policy or the regulation. We're going to follow this rule, this policy, this regulation, and be consistent across all of our data. And it's not up to personal stakeholders' needs. Also, workflows need to integrate for approvals and controls. So as we are deleting data, we need to make sure that we are doing that the right way, making sure that we're not just deleting data without any kind of awareness or control or documentation, because people need to know, for audit trails, need to know that data is being managed properly. And we don't want to have people set aside to just approve to just go delete data without having the right controls in place. And this is also because data teams need those audit trails for documentation, both to ensure that data that was supposed to be removed is actually removed, and to make sure that if data is being removed, we know who is doing it at what time or where, just to have that audit trail to know where data is going. So this is a slide from Gartner. Of course, our own Gartner research. We have different Gartner models, Gartner research, and so we're consulting this to see, what does this look like? How does Gartner see data lifecycle with data classification? And BigID is, really good at discovering all of your data and classifying it, which is really the first step in knowing any kind of data retention policy, because you need to know what data you have and what it is so that you know what kind of rules apply. So we look at this Gartner visual, and we say, the first, you would ingest and identify, which again is how BigID sees the world. We would ingest, all of your, not ingest the data, but we would make sure you have a record of all the data so you know what the data is and then we know where it's coming from. We know what the classification is. We're able to classify data, so we know what that is. So it's discovery, classification. We're going to organize, catalog, have a view of all of our data all in one place. And then we're able to, once we know what it is, then we can classify it to say, here's what you need to do with it. It needs to be protected. It needs to be encrypted. It needs to be making sure people don't have access that shouldn't. So data access control, making sure only the right people have access to the right data. And the first step in that is knowing what is sensitive, what is private, what that data is, so that you know how to manage it. It also means that you know who it belongs to and what it is, what type of data it is, so that you can apply rules like data retention policies or data deletion to be able to manage that data the right way. Let's look at how you can build a data lifecycle management process and just what that means in terms of a 7-step process. So first, we just talked about with Gartner as well, is you need to discover all your data. Where is it coming from? What does it mean? And then classify it, and especially your sensitive data, to know what that data is. Is it a name? Is it an address? Is it a social security number? Is it a credit card number? Is it a, any other form of ID? Is it a healthcare information? Whatever that is, you need to know what the data is, right? Is it customer loyalty card? Whatever it is, to know what it is. And then we need to document those business policies and external regulations. So there are rules about when data should be retained, when it should be deleted. Those can be external regulations that are mandated by by a government agency. It could also be a business policy to say, within your business, we're going to save or delete data for this period of time. And how it's being used, how it's being managed, who should have access. All these things happen within documented policies. Then we're going to determine, once we know what the data is and what the right policies are, we can determine which policies affect which data. So for example, we could say if this is salary data or HR data, who should have access to it, right? And then when should it be deleted, and when should it be retained, and for how long, and in what purpose, and how all these different things we need to know about how to manage that data lifecycle. Once we collect it, we use it, and then we dispose of it properly all along that lifecycle. We also need to consider priority actions and legal holds. So as I mentioned, you might have data that is ready to, we can't just say all data needs to be deleted after a certain number of days or years, because sometimes you need to actually save data for a legal discussion. And so that needs to have priority. So knowing what the priority of rules is, and then how to take action on it. And then, of course, actually doing that. So taking the action to remove expired data assets. It could be with automated deletion, or it could be with assigning the data owner to delete or to remove or archive or whatever you have to do to that data, but taking the action necessary to remove the expired data assets. And then audit for completeness. That means you need to have a record to make sure that the actions were in fact taken, the data is being protected the right way. This is a visual of the BigID platform. We're going to look at this as an example to show how we can apply BigID to help with your data lifecycle management needs. So in this visual, you can see there are kind of three disks, 3 pillars, 3 layers. At the bottom is where you connect your data. This is important because we're going to connect all of our data. So it's not just from one data source, but it's from everything. So it's all data, it's structured, it's unstructured. It could be in the cloud, it could be on-prem. Whatever that data is, we're going to have a management of all data all in one place. And that's going to be important so that we can apply any kind of policies or rules to all data. The middle layer is where we know our data. So know your data means being able to add that automated classification. So knowing what the data is, defining it, what it is, who it belongs to, what it means, so that we can do things like knowing what is your privacy data, or what is sensitive security data, or how do you have augmented metadata with things like the age and where it is, what it is, and then finding the duplicate and low quality data so that you can eliminate anything that's unnecessary. If you have multiple copies of sensitive data, that is just increasing your data risk. You want to just remove those duplicate data assets so you don't have exposed risk. So that's your know your data layer. And then on top is action your data. And so these are all kinds of different apps we can put on top of the data. We can do things like adding data quality. In the case of your data stewardship or glossary, all these things we can add on top of the data. But in this case, we're going to talk specifically about our data lifecycle management. So we're going to focus on doing things like data retention, data remediation, and deletion. So we're going to talk specifically about those applications next. So this is the BigID data lifecycle management solution. And if you remember that pillar we just saw, that top layer were all the apps. And when we talk about data lifecycle management, specifically, we're talking about how do you first, discover all your data, classify it, know what it is, and then the actions you're going to take on top of that are these three apps. We have a data retention, which is to establish and execute policies to expire or save the data. We have data remediation, which is a workflow for delegating tasks to remove or correct the data. So once you know that something needs to be expired or corrected or removed or whatever that is, you need to assign someone to take that action. Or you have this data deletion, which will just remove the data assets. You have a whole workflow to have a approval trail, an audit trail, make sure you know who is doing what, and then keep an audit trail so that you can just automatically delete anything that needs to be expired and removed. If you look at let's look at each one of these in a little bit more depth. The first one here is this data retention app. And the data retention app is going to allow you to have consistent data retention management policies across all data types and all data sources. Here's what comes together, where we talked about that bottom layer where we connected all of the different data sources, different types. And the reason this is important is because when we apply our data retention policies, we want to apply those policies to all data. So regardless of where it comes from, where it is, we want to have consistency. And so being able to have retention policies across all data is important. We have out-of-the-box policies. So we know that there are certain policies, certain rules, regulations that everyone has to follow. So we have out-of-the-box policies, or you can create custom policies if you have certain business level policies, or you can actually import data retention policy sets. So from all those different regulations in all kinds of different geographies, you can actually import those sets of policies to apply what you need, what is relevant for your data. The reason people need a data retention app is because it is scalable and efficient. If you were trying to all manage this manually, imagine you'd have to first identify what data is. Is this an email? Is it a contact number? Is it a name, an address? Is it a credit card number? And then determine what it is, determine how long you've had it, where it is, who it belongs to, what rules apply, and then go take action. It would be a nightmare to have to do this manually. So having a scalable and efficient way to add automation is really going to help your data lifecycle management be much more efficient and effective and complete. We would also manage the priority policies for legal exceptions. So what that means is that if we have a legal hold, if we have data we need to store for any legal reasons, we can flag that, set it aside, and do that all in one automated group, so that when we go set our expiration and set our retention policies, we know that these data assets need to be retained because there's a legal hold. Then you can set all kinds of rules around those as well. So we need to identify which data to retain, which data to delete, and do this in an automated way, and then audit for compliance to make sure that action was taken. The remediation app is what's going to come into play next. So once we've determined the retention policies, we've set the rules, we have the data associated with the right policies, we know what needs to be deleted or retained or what has to happen to it, then we can send it over to the remediation app. The remediation app is going to allow us to take action in kind of big groups to make sure that we know what data needs to be remediated. And then we can assign owners and priority dates to make sure the action takes place. We can leverage workflow integration, so either having it all managed through BigID or integrating with any other enterprise solutions where you're used to assigning workflow actions. And then finally, we can notify, audit, and report. So you can run a report and make sure that the action was taken. This is really important for compliance as well, to make sure that actions taken, if you have expired data, make sure stuff is getting deleted as it's supposed to be deleted. Data deletion app, along actually with the data remediation, is also important for business continuity. So to make sure that as people change jobs and move around the organization, you have someone that is assigned to take the action necessary. In this case, we're talking about the data deletion app. And for deletion, what that means is that we have deletion rules for consistency. We're not able to, people don't want to just delete data because there is definitely a fear that you're going to delete the wrong thing. So what this does is it adds a workflow to have the right people, make sure there's an audit, make sure that you're following all the right rules so that when data is deleted, it is deleted properly and completely, and also that it is appropriately deleted. So we're going to remove data here to comply with data privacy regulations and business policies. What that means is we can set the rules, we can determine what data needs to be expired on what time, and then we can run through here to delete it automatically without needing to go through and be dependent on any other person to do that. We just need a workflow just to approve, and it's good to go. So we have the approval workflows, the assigned experts for sign-off, and then we can confirm the deletion was complete. And again, maintaining an audit trail is important because you want to be compliant. Also, if someone requests, if you get a personal request to delete my data, you want to make sure that that delete action was taken and that you can audit and prove and back that it was taken appropriately. In summary, when we talk about BigID, data lifecycle management, we're really talking about our core strength, of course, is that starting with discovery, knowing what you have, being able to classify all of your data automatically, doing that deeper discovery to know what the data is, and then adding the intelligence to say, okay, we know that this data is an element is an ID or a name or a phone number or a credit card or who it belongs to, or it's medical or legal, whatever that is, determining what the data is, adding the intelligence, and then being able to take action on it. So applying retention, remediation, deletion in order to have automated data lifecycle management. Our goal, of course, is to have compliance and a clean data set to have a clean data environment. And the benefits of using BigID for data lifecycle management are we're going to automate those complex retention requirements. We're going to remove the manual processes. As I mentioned, it's really, really hard. If you think about if you had to determine what all of your data was, what were the correct actions to apply, what the retention policies were, and then as data grows and gets more and more complex, it would be nearly impossible to be able to do data retention and data lifecycle management properly using only manual processes. We're going to reduce risk because now, if you use the BigID data lifecycle management solution, you're going to reduce the risk of storing expired sensitive data, because once you know that data is sensitive and you know the expiration date, you don't want to be keeping it any more than you need to, because it's just going to increase your risk of having data that could be, possibly exposed for any kind of breach, or just having data exposed is just not something that your company needs to have to take on extra risk. It's much better to eliminate the risk, eliminate the expense of storing and protecting expired sensitive data. Storing extra data is expensive, right? We don't need to be spending extra money and wasting money on storage cost for data we do not need. It's expired, it's risk, it's extra risk, it's extra cost, we just don't need it. So BigID can help eliminate that expense as well. And maintaining compliance is really important. We have regulatory requirements that are coming out. A lot of them are being enforced now, and we're seeing new requirements come out. From different geographies, different countries, different states even have different requirements about how privacy requirements about when to remove and delete data for privacy reasons, or when to retain data for other reasons that people need to hold on to data for employee data, or there are other reasons, health reasons, etc. So making sure that you are compliant with all of those lifecycle management rules. And then protecting trust with employees and customers. People want to know and want to trust that you are going to protect their data, that you're going to treat it the right way, that you're going to make sure that it is protected while you have it, only have it while you need it, and then it's going to be properly disposed of. So people are much more aware of their personal data and want to make sure they're doing business with other businesses with it. We're going to respect their data and make sure they are compliant with all of these rules. So having an automated solution with BigID for data lifecycle management is going to help protect that trust that you have with your employees and customers. That brings us to the end of this BigID education. I invite you to please join us over at bigid.com for a demo of the data lifecycle management and see how it works and how it can help you in all of your data retention needs. And thank you for watching. Hope this was helpful. I hope it's helpful. Thank you for watching.